All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really big and honestly kind of intimidating idea, the Buddhist concept of emptiness. But we're going to come at it through a surprising lens, neuroscience, and the strange ways our brains literally build the reality that you see and feel every single day.
So, let's just jump right in with the story. And it sounds like the beginning of a thriller. Check this out. There's a man, we'll call him Fred, and he's looking right at his wife. He can see her face, he knows her features, but he is absolutely, terrifyingly convinced she's an imposter.
Yeah, so this totally bizarre condition, it's called Capgras delusion. And see, Fred's problem wasn't his eyesight. He could see his wife just fine. The problem was what he couldn't feel. That woman in front of him, she was missing what you might call her essence of wife. Some critical, invisible layer of recognition was just gone.
Okay, so this brings up a really wild question, right? Buddhist philosophy talks about emptiness as this deep realization that things don't have some fixed, built-in essence. So was Fred, in his own strange way, getting a glimpse of that? Could this brain malfunction actually be some kind of spiritual breakthrough?
Well, according to the author, Robert Wright, the short answer is a hard no, not even close. The logic is pretty simple. The whole point of enlightenment is to lose your delusions, not to get a brand new one. Fred's experience wasn't clarity. It was a tragic glitch in the system.
But here's the interesting part. The best theory for what was happening to Fred points to a disconnect, a communication breakdown between the part of his brain that sees and the part that feels. He could see his wife, but he wasn't getting that jolt of warm, familiar feeling that should go with it. And that gap, that space between seeing and feeling, might just be the key to understanding what's going on in the brain during deep meditation.
And that leads us right into our next section, the feeling of knowing. Because this really gets to the core of it, right? We think we just see stuff and know what it is. But what if it's way more complicated? What if our brain is automatically adding this invisible layer of feeling to everything we perceive?
So to really get our heads around this, we need to talk about a concept from the psychologist Paul Bloom. It's called essentialism. And it's this thing we all do, this tendency to believe that everything, people, objects, you name it, has some kind of invisible inner core, a hidden soul that makes it what it is.
For example, just look at this number. $48,875. That's how much someone paid for a simple tape measure at an auction. You gotta ask, was it made of solid gold? Did it measure a secret dimension? Nope, it was just a regular tape measure, but it had belonged to John F. Kennedy. The person who bought it wasn't paying for the metal and plastic, they were paying for its story, for its perceived presidential essence. That story alone was worth almost 50 grand.
And here's an example that shows the exact same thing, just from the opposite direction. The Nazi leader Hermann Goering had this Vermeer painting he absolutely treasured. When he found out it was a fake, the actual object hadn't changed one bit, but its story, its history, its essence was completely destroyed in an instant. The feeling was gone, and suddenly it was just worthless paint on canvas. Okay, so this storytelling thing is pretty obvious for famous stuff. But what about everything else? You know, your coffee mug, that tree outside, the sound of the bus going by? Well, it turns out our brains are doing this all the time, constantly, and subtly attaching these little feeling-based stories to almost everything we run into. Our brains are basically automatic evaluation machines. Psychologists call this affective priming. And what it means is, before you even have a conscious thought about something, your brain has already slapped a little tag on it, good or bad, positive or negative.
Here's a classic way they test this. If you briefly show someone the word sunshine, their brain gets primed, and they'll recognize a positive word like glorious a few milliseconds faster. And on the flip side, show them the word disease, and they'll be quicker to recognize horrible. It just shows that our concepts have this emotional charge baked right in, before we even start thinking.
This was shown perfectly in a famous experiment with wine experts. They were given 2 different wines to taste, or so they thought. One bottle was labeled as being $10, the other was $90. And surprise, surprise, they all said the $90 wine was way better. The big reveal, of course? It was the exact same cheap wine in both bottles.
But here's the kicker. This wasn't just in their heads. It wasn't just them saying it tasted better.
Brain scans showed that the higher price tag, the story, was actually lighting up a key pleasure center in their brains. The belief didn't just change their opinion, it literally, physically made the wine taste better.
And this is what led the psychologist Paul Bloom to this really powerful conclusion. There's really no such thing as a simple pleasure. Everything is filtered through the lens of what we believe about it. You're never just tasting wine. You're tasting expensive wine or cheap wine, and that story completely changes the experience itself.
So this all leads to a really fascinating question, doesn't it? What would it actually be like to perceive the world without this constant overlay of stories and feelings and judgments? What happens when that link between seeing and feeling gets weaker? To figure that out, researchers started looking at advanced meditators.
Let's take a look at Gary Weber. He's a scientist who has meditated for literally tens of thousands of hours. And when they put him in a brain scanner, they found that his default mode network, that's the part of the brain linked to mind wandering and all that self-centered chatter, it's incredibly quiet, even when he's just resting. His whole baseline state of being seems to have shifted.
So, back to the wine. How would he experience that glass of wine? He says he still enjoys the pure sensation of it. But what's gone is what he calls the carry forward, that internal story, the judgment, the little voice that says, wow, this is a fantastic glass of wine, what a great year. The raw experience is there, but the commentary track is gone.
And Weber says this isn't a loss at all. He calls it a cleaner perception. For him, it's a gain in clarity. By taking away that layer of story, you get to perceive the thing itself more directly. In a way, by seeing through the essence that our minds project, you get closer to this idea of emptiness, not as some spooky void, but as a direct, unfiltered reality.
And that leaves us with this really interesting chicken and egg situation. From the neuroscience side, the author's theory is that stuff like meditation dampens the feeling first, and that then lets you perceive emptiness. The traditional Buddhist view is the other way around. You first gain the insight into emptiness, and that's what quiets down the emotional noise. So which is it? What comes first?
So why does any of this matter? Why have we spent all this time talking about tape measures and brain scans and wine? Because this whole automatic habit we have of building an essence for things out of feelings and stories, it doesn't just stop with objects. It has implications that are way, way more serious.
Robert Wright warns that this is more than just a little mental quirk. Believing that the essences we feel are real things out there in the world, instead of just constructions of our own minds, well, that can have consequences that are, as he puts it, pretty grave. Because this powerful mechanism doesn't stop with inanimate objects.
And that's really the final thought to chew on. This entire mental machine that we have for creating stories, for projecting essence, for deciding what's valuable or what's worthless, it doesn't just switch off when we look at another person. So what happens when the essences we construct and the stories we tell are about entire groups of human beings? That's something to think about. Thanks for joining us on The Explainer.